Hello, everyone. I think it's time to start. Bonjour à tous. My name is Magali Girard. I'm the Executive Director of the Quebec Inter-University Center for Social Statistics. And it is my pleasure today to welcome Professor Lars Vilhuber as part of our Midi Webinaire or Brown Bag webinar series. Lars is an economist at Cornell University in the Department of Economics and the School of Industrial and Labor Relations, and also the data editor for the American Economic Association Journal. So thank you, Lars, for being here today. And today is a special webinar, as Lars will talk about, I have in my notes, reproducibility in economics, why and how, but maybe there's a nuance to be made with reproducibility, or is it a synonym? I'll let Lars explain. And so our webinars are always the same format. So I'll let Lars do his presentations, and we will have 10-15 minutes at the end for Q&As. So I'm inviting you to use the chat room to write down your questions, or maybe if you'd like to ask directly at the end of the presentations, you're more than welcome to do so. Okay, merci Lars pour ta présence.
Okay, thank you, Magali, for inviting me. Let me start by sharing my slides. Okay, we should be set there. And just for reference, si vous voulez poser des questions en français dans le chat ou en anglais, it's however you like it to be. Okay, so Magali was asking what the actual topic is. We're going to start with reproducibility, the why and how. I'll actually also get to what we actually mean by that. So let me start by putting a disclaimer. I have to do that, that whatever I'm saying here is my opinion, not the American Economic Association or QICSS or any of the other funding agencies. And if you I'll linger here for a few seconds. If you want to capture the QR code, it'll lead you right to these slides. Okay, so first of all, Magali gave a brief introduction. Why should you listen to what I'm saying here? For one, I think the key part here is that I'm the American Economic Association's data editor. And what that means is that all those journals that you see on the right are within the portfolio that we evaluate the reproducibility of. What that means in practice is that since I was appointed, we've handled, this is a snapshot from a few weeks ago, nearly 2,400 manuscripts. There is always a bit of a back and forth. So we've written over 4,000 reports, and I've estimated that at least potentially there's about 4,500 authors that we've reached with our reports. And we've gotten feedback from them. As you can imagine, not everybody's always happy to get a report from the editor that makes them do something and go another round. So what I'm going to be talking about are why do we even have this? That's part of the why. The what is what are we even talking about if you haven't put together a replication package. I'll briefly describe what that means and what should be in those replication packages. And the how will be, and we're not going to get too deeply into that, the how will be, how can you get there? How can you do this? Because as it turns out, this probably wasn't in your academic curriculum, and you're not alone. Those 4,400 authors are probably in the same boat as you might think you are in as well. Okay. So why do we even want to think about reproducibility? My key hook here tends to be the focus on not just reproducibility, but reproducibility as an indicator of transparency. So think of it this way: if you are trying to rerun somebody else's code in order to get their answers, what it necessarily entails for that to be complete is that you have access to all of the data, that you have access to all of the code, and that you can then inspect everything that was done. And that's, I think, the most important part. It's not really that it runs, but rather because it runs, you can actually now start to think of why does it run, what is it doing, all those kinds of things. So it enhances credibility. It helps to sort of support the science that is there. We are scientists when we publish these papers, and we should lay out what are the methods of getting there. How did you do something? You claim that you did one thing. Is that actually what your code does? Is that actually what your data supports? All those kinds of things enhance the credibility of the research that is there. So not just the advertisement that is the article, in the words of Donahue, but also the background to it, all enhance that. So transparency then helps us to tease those things apart. Once I can look at the survey that you actually ran, I can question, are those actually the right constructs that you used? I see this other construct here. Were those correctly coded, or maybe were they correctly translated? Did you manipulate that census data that you got in certain ways? That transparency enhances the credibility of everything that goes out there, because once I do that, and I come to the same conclusion as you are, I might be even more convinced by what you're saying. So why is this maybe a recent phenomenon? Well, what you see here on the screen is actually a, let me call it a replication package from 1911. And the reason I like this is for various aspects of it. One is that this is over 100 years old, and yet we can still see the data that these people used in this particular article in the American Economic Review. And if we wanted to, we can recover that, we can reuse the data, we can redo the analysis, we might figure out that they did it wrong. This was really easy in the early 20th century because there was only one way to communicate all these things, it's by printing it. And as you can see here, this is a fold-out table in an actual journal. We haven't seen those in a while, and in part, as we became more sophisticated, things got scattered about a bit. Data became electronic, was no longer included, because how could you include electronic data in a printed publication? Math was translated into code, so instead of just having a matrix, and this is the matrix, and you start to invert it and have a graduate student spending the summer on inverting it, you have code that does that for you in a couple of seconds. So things got more efficient for the researchers, but it didn't necessarily get more efficient for those who wanted to redo that analysis. So there has been some progress. There's been a broader consensus in academia about some of the principles that we're going to leverage here. FAIR principles, findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable is something that you will find quite a lot in Europe, a bit in Canada, and a bit less in the US. But what that means is that all the data that underlies these various research works, you need to be able to find them. Somebody needs to be able to access them. You need to understand what is going on here, what the structure of the data is, and others should be able to actually use them. So it shouldn't just be you who can use them. So that enhances part of that. In order to get there, you might have to rely on data citation principles in order to make the data findable in the first place. So what that means is you all know how to cite stuff. Well, do you know how to cite data? Most people don't. And so that's an increasingly important part of how we think about the overall structure. It brings back this idea of, in that 1911 paper, it's pretty easy to cite the data. It's on page so-and-so of the article in a printed version. How do you do that with modern data that's digital? That's something that, for instance, data citations actually entail. And all of this is to some extent a reaction to what became known as the reproducibility crisis. What that means is that lots of people tried to actually redo the analysis in published packages, and found that that was a bit harder than they expected it to be. The graph on the right shows sort of my collection of various studies over the years, with both size of the number of studies and the degree to which they could actually reproduce the findings of those studies based on the materials provided by those authors. And you can see that it languishes around pretty low numbers throughout the 80s, 90s, and 2000s. What happened since then, since the early 2000s, is that there is new technology that came into place. We started to implement replication archives, data availability policies. The ones for the AEA that I'm responsible for, the first one appeared around 2005, in part in reaction to those findings at the time that still said, well, all of that is still not great. We also, and this is really important, started to use and have available to us lots of shared open source software, so that now we don't have to figure out which particular C or Fortran or COBOL compiler we need to do in order to get your results, which might differ. And we've had lots of better public use and even shared confidential data. QICSS is the Quebec part of the Canadian Research Data Center Network that provides, for instance, access to the Canadian confidential data in a way that others can access the same data that I might have used in my study. And so things have gotten better. The colored graphs, the colored bubbles in the late 20-teens are from various studies that have looked at data accessibility, conditional on that data accessibility, how reproducible are things. So that orange button is something that came from a study that I did, which was published last year in the Canadian Journal of Economics with a couple of co-authors. And that conditional on having data, it can actually work fairly well, but still not good enough. So what do we actually in practice mean by reproducibility? So we'll start with what the policies actually say. So I mentioned that I'm responsible for those 8 AEA journals, but I'll also highlight here the Canadian Journal of Economics. I don't think Marie's on the line, but Marie Connolly from UQAM is the data editor for the Canadian Journal of Economics, who also has a policy. As it turns out, we have more or less a similar policy. So what that policy says is you need to provide a replication package, and it goes into a lot of detail about what that actually means. So I already mentioned that it should probably contain all the code that goes from the raw data, the data that you collected or that you got from somebody else, all the way through to the analysis in the paper. So those figures that you drop into your paper should come from code that you provide, or instructions. If for some reason there's something there that can't be done with code, which is our modern way of doing this, instructions are fine. It should also ideally have the data. If you collected the data, you should be able to provide such data. If you collected it from some other place, you probably can provide some of that data. You should probably provide some of that data, and if not, point to where the data is. So if data is not included, you access some data, I need to know where that data comes from. So instructions on how to obtain the data, and finally, instructions how to combine it all, which might be as mundane as download data from here, put it into a particular folder, which might have, here's what I manually edited to it, here's what code you need to run to do this. And then you might pull that all together and buckle it up and make a replication package out of it. So at the AEA, we have a data and code availability policy, which in turn is consistent with what we call the data and code availability standard, which is common to a few journals. I'll be pointing them out at the end. It looks like this, but how is it practically implemented? Well, once you have read the policy and the guidance that's there, regardless of the journal, you compile a replication package. What we do nowadays is we don't necessarily put them up as a zip file attached to some journal website somewhere. We actually have and use repositories. Now, these repositories are designed to solve that other thing from the 1911 AER. They're supposed to preserve the contents. So we have a deal with OpenICPSR. That's where the AEA data and code repository is, but any other trusted repository is fine. Okay. So I mentioned this before, the provenance of the data, the ones that's there, needs to be clearly and precisely documented. And this is a theme that will come up over and over again in these kinds of things. It needs to be clearly and precisely documented. It needs to be complete, right? So the package needs to be complete. All the data needs to be identified. All the code needs to be provided. All the materials need to be provided. If you collected data using a survey, in order for me to attempt to replicate it, I need the materials to use in order to be precise about that. And this is where the trusted repositories comes in. We're now going to preserve that which goes along with the article, which we hope will still be there in 100 years from now. Well, the data and the code, to the extent that we can, should also be preserved for that. Okay. So ideally, all of this comes within the replication package, but there might be terms of use, there might be data use agreements that prevent you from sharing stuff in a replication package. We'll get to that maybe in a moment. And otherwise, you can put it into a different trusted repository, which is anything more or less that provides you with a DOI, with some exceptions. Importantly, all the code must be there as well. So many of the modern methods that you might have seen sort of put codes, yeah, I have it on my personal website or I have a GitHub repository. Those are excellent ways of sharing the code. They're really poor ways to preserve the code for the same lifetime that the article might be preserved. So this is, again, it goes into a trusted repository. So historically, this was our deposit, right? Printed out there. Nowadays, it'll look like something like this. It'll have an online browsable interface to it. This is at OpenICPSR, which is committed to preserving this as long as it has funding and has successfully had funding for the past 50 years. And the same is then true if you go to, say, Borealis in Canada or Zenodo in Europe or other places like that. Those are trusted repositories whose business model is built around preserving data. Are there exceptions to the policy? Principle, the short answer is no, they're not. But of course, if you don't control access to the data, you don't have the rights to access the data, to distribute the data, then we can't force you to do that either. So this is where the description of the access comes from. So the exception is not to the description, the exception is to provision of the data. You always need to document how you got the data. Again, a bit of a gray zone. What happens if you're documenting corruption in mayoral offices in some locations in Kenya? Obviously, you might not want to actually name the places where you ran the survey of some mayoral candidates or something like that because of the sensitivity of that. So other scenarios are that you got data from an e-commerce company to analyze something that goes on there, and they don't want to be in the media, so they actually don't allow you to name the company. So those are conditions where we're going to go back and forth between you, the editor, and others, but those are certainly things that can be solvable. We're not trying to do stuff here that forces people to contravene agreements that they have in place. But this can be built in from the start, okay? But again, as for emphasis, there's no exception for the need to describe the access, and there's no exception to fully describe the processing. Okay. Is this just in econ? I'll just point out that that data and code availability standard was developed by an ad hoc working group, essentially, of various journals' data editors. It is accessible. It has been used. Here's just a list of the journals that are currently subscribing to that. I have it on pretty good internal knowledge that the Journal of Political Economy will also soon adopt that DCAS. It's very much aligned with what I just mentioned. We also developed in our working group a template README that allows you to well describe the contents of it, to tease out, if you think of this as a survey, all the elements that we'd like others to learn in what is there about the data. But data and code availability practices are also present in some of the other social sciences. Here are the two political science journals that I'm aware of, and there are others that also do this. This is also a thing coming in sociology. Here's sociological science. Now, it doesn't mean that this is necessarily always homogeneous, move forward within each discipline. My colleague at Cornell, Kim Whedon, wrote an article on the tension even within disciplines, and in particular between qualitative and quantitative analyses on this idea of transparency and reproducibility. So this is a movement, but it's not universal. Okay. So why should you actually care about this? Other than the fact that this is something that's happening if you are part of the discipline, what are the benefits? Well, I'll start with benefits to you personally as a researcher. Reproducibility, in my mind, is always associated with efficiency. What we're trying to do is to efficiently document where you got the data from, how the code runs, and all those other things. Well, if you describe it so that others can do it well, then your RA, if you have the luck of having an RA, can also do that. Or you yourself, once you get back to this paper after a semester teaching a ton of stuff that prevented you from doing that, you can very quickly get back to it. If you actually have the culmination of reproducibility, a single master file that will run everything, then you can actually run that everything quite a lot. What, as data editors, we always tend to look at each other and say, at this point, I'm not going to submit anything unless I know that at the very end I can run it all again and be sure that the results actually hold up to scrutiny. So that reassurance is something I hear from other researchers as well on a regular basis, is very important as well. I did have one article that I pointed to at some point in time that apparently non-reproducible results are a major source of stress for PhD candidates in psychology. This was a psychological study, which I think was reproducible. And finally, the benefit to you is the credibility of your research, as I pointed out earlier, is a direct benefit to you. You actually get more citations because of that. That is still an open question, in part because those things are measured over large quantities of articles and over enough time to measure that. And right now that's still pretty noisy because this regime of intense replication packages where reproducibility is actually verified by data editors like myself hasn't been going on that long. So we have some indication that that's out, but it's not entirely clear. So I'd love to have some empirical facts for that, but I don't. A benefit to you as well, and this is something that I regularly hear as data editor, is people contacting me to sort of say, do you have a couple papers that you can recommend that I can use in my classes? And then there's other researchers who rely on papers to sort of build new knowledge on top of that, so creating new papers. So the ability by others to reuse something from you, and you get cited through that, is obviously a benefit to you, but is of course also a benefit to others, the ability to reuse this more efficiently. So those are, that's sort of where it starts to get into the broader context. Some of my favorite examples of where reproducibility actually comes in are econometric articles that sort of go back and sort of say, are all these previous papers, how can we improve on them? There's findings that are there, etc. There's a paper by Jonathan Roth in 2022 out of the journals that I had. And in particular, you'll notice that he had to exclude several papers because they didn't have the data available and were not able to run the core part of the analysis. What that means is that, you know, if you want to be cited, those 43 authors are not going to be cited in this. There is, of course, all the two-way fixed effects that's going on there. They also very often go back and recompute and empirically demonstrate the benefits of what they're doing in this and improve. You know, if somebody picks your paper to do that, that might be initially uncomfortable, but it also helps to build the next paper that is then possibly more robust. Okay. And that should illustrate as well that there's also a potential cost to this transparency. It's not all just benefit side. There's pain to transparency, right? Let me just say that this might, some people might find this disturbing. Remember this guy? If you're involved in American politics, you surely do. This is Matt Gaetz. Well, what was the problem with Matt Gaetz is that transparency was pretty clear in terms of who he was paying lots of money for. So that's one example of painful transparency. But closer to home in economics, if you haven't been hiding under a rock and are on social media, the Institute for Replication just put out a thread where they looked at several papers coming from a specific NGO and identified some problems with those papers. The key part is that this was only possible because data and code for these papers were available. Now, for the authors of those papers, this is, of course, painful. But for the greater good of science, this is exactly what we need in the sense that we can actually inspect this and identify what's going on. I should point out that the Institute for Replication runs replication games. There will be one this summer as well. And most of the findings from such replication games are actually in support of the analysis done in the papers. Oh, look, this robustness check, actually, it seems like the authors already thought of that, yields no different results. So transparency is uncomfortable. It puts us into a situation where others can question what we're doing. Okay, so this is all fine as a general theme. How do you actually create reproducible research? This is something we hear quite often as data editors, and when authors come and the paper's done, etc. Oh my gosh, I now need to put together a replication package. Some of the things that we've observed within our data editor community is that habits matter a lot. People who have reproducible research habits actually have much less work to do on that last day before submitting than people who don't, who have to scrounge around and figure out what actually happened here. We don't actually have a lot of horror stories, but there are a few where papers have been withdrawn at that last date because, as it turns out, as they were cleaning up everything, things broke and were no longer reproducible or actually led to different results. So that's not something that people want to have. So reproducibility from day one, reproducible habits, taking notes. If you download something from someplace, take a note of where it was, what were you doing, some sort of version control. And you don't have to be a Git wizard to do version control. There's also other version control, but you need to know what was run, when, and how. Okay. Some of the tools we provide, the template README I mentioned earlier is available. We encourage people to use that from the start of a particular research project or as early as possible. We have tons of tools on the various websites about programming tricks that help you streamline processing. One of the most frequent ones is save figures and tables programmatically. Don't copy and paste them into your article. It's a one-liner in your code. You should always use those kinds of things, even if it's not necessarily the prettiest or most convenient table, but save all these things practically. When should you learn this? Well, like I said, we've taken reproducibility up a notch. And of course, very few people have had this as part of their curriculum. That's still true today. Even in my home institution, we're only now building it as part of the graduate school's curriculum into that of the PhD student. So if you're senior faculty or you're an undergrad student, these things are all the fundamentals of how we conduct science, are easily teachable and learnable at whatever level it is. One of the most obvious two tips that we can give is run everything from scratch if you can before finalizing. You'd be surprised how many packages we actually get that clearly have not been run again because they can't run. And think of computational empathy, a term that I think I might have coined. Think of the next person to run this. That's not going to be you who's been working on this project for 5 years, who knows every in and out of this. It might be your next RA. It could be you in 5 years when that R&R finally comes back, because that's what publishing in econ still is. There are a ton of advanced tools that one can talk about. Most are not used broadly in economics, using environments, using containers, planning for failure, robust code that does those kinds of things. But none of those are barriers. You don't have to be at the cutting edge. You can use Excel for tables, but there are ways to do so reproducible. You can use manual processing as long as it's in limits and not something that is easily replaced, possibly as a time saver with that. Confidential data is not a barrier to reproducible research. We all have a lot of stuff on that. Most of these have relatively simple solutions, and we can dig more into those with hands-on in the summer school that I think might be going into the chat. And with that, I'll stop here and say thank you.
Merci beaucoup, Lars. Thank you so much. Very, very interesting. Pascal added in the chat a link to the QICSS summer school that will be taught in May by Lars at UQAM in Montreal this summer, and it's during the Canadian Economics Association annual meeting. So please send the link if you're interested, or send me an email if you have questions, or Lars. And now it's time for questions. So please use the chat or open your mic if you like to ask questions directly. Thank you so much. And Lars, you put up a link to the PowerPoint presentation that you've just given. I was wondering how popular are reproducibility papers in journals? I know you're the editor for all the American economics journals, but I'm guessing it's been increasing in popularity over the past years, given the FAIR principles and all the about open science and stuff. So I was wondering, like, how often do you get papers that are reproducibility paper, or that you check for papers that may be that have all the paperwork for making it reproducible?
So I think there's two questions in there. How many
Yeah.
papers do we actually get that are reproductions or
Mhm.
or robustness checks of others?
Mhm.
And that's actually a hard question to answer because clean reproducible checks don't find a lot of outlets in economics journals. That's not where most people put their priorities as journal editors. But there are a lot of papers that start out with a finding and start out with reproducing that finding and then saying, yes, but you didn't do this or this or this, and we should look into that, etc. And so those are a bit hard to identify. There are a few studies out there that have looked at this sort of dark presence of reproducibility and put a small number on that, which is certainly larger than the 0 that we observe otherwise. There are newer outlets that are focusing on the reproducibility checks, and I'll call out the Institute for Replication again, in terms of running the replication games and then going after the people who did try to reproduce some of those papers that are in there and then actually publish the results regardless of whether or not it's a confirmation or a repudiation of that particular journal. Obviously, when it's controversial, it gets more attention. That seems to be where the attention seekers are. And so it's really important to also publish the positive reproductions. It's just that they're not easy to get into the normal publication stream. In terms of papers that are actually reproducible, well, in principle, every paper having come out of the verifications that we and others at other journals that have data editors do, who actually run the code, should in principle be reproducible. If you ever run into a paper that turns out not to be reproducible, we actually have a feedback mechanism. We don't necessarily run all the data, all the code when the data is in part confidential. Other people have access to that confidential data and can say, well, yes, if we actually do run this, then this happens. And so we actually get about a dozen corrections to reproducibility archives in the course of a given year, at least in the past years. I kind of feel that we've already had more corrections this year than we've had in the entire past year. So maybe something is going on there. But people say, I ran this, I corresponded with the author, there's a file missing that you could only have detected if you actually ran this. And then they update the replication package, and all future reproducers will then have access to those kinds of things. So in principle, they're all supposed to be reproducible at this point.
Thank you. I have one more question, but I'll check with I'll run by you the questions that we have in the chat. So where can we find the template README file?
We'll go to the slides that I posted. At the very end is a list of resources, and the template README, if my memory is right, is actually linked in there.
What is the etiquette for asking for the code? Do you ask the journal or the author? I have asked authors and gotten crickets.
Well, I mean, that's part of the reason why we actually have, I'm just looking. Actually, I don't have the template README linked at the end of this presentation, but I'll add it to that. So Aaron, thanks for pointing that out.
Pascal posted the
Yeah,
link.
okay, that's the good one. Yeah.
Okay, good.
So etiquette, well, part of the reason why we have a code and data availability policy is to avoid having to ask the author. It's the journal who's asked the author. The journal has put it onto an open website, and the conditions are such that you do not need permission to use the data, at least not for the purpose of reproduction. Very, very rarely we will see that that is a restriction in the sense that you can't use the data that's in there or something else for your own future research, and that is legitimate. but most of the replication packages that are out there are under an open reuse license. You're supposed to cite the replication package, but otherwise you don't have to do anything. That's of course because you get not a good response rate when asking authors, right? So we have a very good response rate for that, because if they don't give it to us and publish it, they don't get published. You don't have that if you're going somewhere else.
Is there a consensus on which programming language to use to ensure reproducibility?
Nope.
Quick answer.
Let me say that you probably shouldn't use Excel and Visual Basic. But apart from that, if you look at the software distribution, most economists still use Stata and/or MATLAB. There is an increasing use of R and Python and Julia and stuff like that, but it's coming from a relatively low base. And honestly, they pose different reproducibility issues. You don't need to buy a license, but they're also fast evolving. So we actually encounter more problems in terms of getting a package to be reproducible with the open source languages, simply because they are so much more dynamic, and because most economists don't actually use the practices that are in place, which are not perfect either, but that are in place to sort of ensure that with such a dynamic background, you actually do that. If you want to learn on how to do reproducible R, come to our workshop. We'll take that up as an example.
Thank you. Have any you talked about the restricted data, like the Statistics Canada microdata that are available in research data centers. So do you have any recommendations for national statistics agencies such as Statistics Canada when researchers want to publish papers that uses their data, but that are being asked by journals like the ones that you are editor for, that ask for a reproducibility package?
So this comes up on a regular basis in a variety of contexts. So just within the last week, we've had privileged editor access to the General Social Survey in the US, because they put in place a mechanism that if somebody had already a no authorized project, then our check of that project is in scope, and they have a special procedure in place to do that. That would be awesome if many other data providers would do that. Helps in this case that Jeremy Fries, a prominent sociologist who is very much in favor of reproducibility, is on the board of the GSS in the US, and so I was happy to see that. There are places where the data provider, and I won't name them right now, has come at the end and said, no, you can't even describe how your data cleaning code comes. You can't excerpt that from the environment, even though the authors planned for this right from the start. There are ways to write your code to make it be non-sensitive from a security point, which is a legitimate point about this, or from a privacy point, and yet still be very much reproducible if you do these kinds of things. There's standard ways of doing this in the computer sciences. There appear not to be standard ways of doing this in law school, so that might be one of the problems there. So things can be tricky in that context. Statistical agencies are typically pretty good about this. The key part is the preservation of those files within the confidential areas. And you and I both know from our work with Statistics Canada that that's, at least in that context, is a bit of a challenge occasionally. There are backup procedures in place for live files that are on live systems, but we have run into issues actually where we did do a reproducibility check and the files had been corrupted in some ways and were not covered by the backup, and thus getting them back again turned out to be not exactly the same file, and those things are problematic. As a researcher, you can't just make your private copy of that. That's not an option, and so you have to work with the agency. You have to request from the agency that these things are there. Agencies on their side have legitimate funding problems. It is not trivial to maintain an archive of every possible file ever provided to researchers out there. It's feasible. And so how to navigate that is something that happens at science councils, where people need to push for this kind of thing, and within various boards of these kinds of scenarios. So there's a broad spectrum between data that you and I can access, and I'm still signing the papers to get access to that GSS. It has to be on a secure computer. I'm lucky enough to have that at Cornell, where I just rely on infrastructure at the university to do that kind of thing. But they're going to give me the exact file that they also gave to the researchers, because they have an internal management system where that's actually possible. And there's a few other statistical agencies around the world that I typically bring up as examples of good practices where you actually have some reassurance that if somebody else comes around, or you come around 5 years from now, you will actually get back the same file.
Thank you. Okay, yeah, so there was a question about more info about the workshop, and Pascal just put up the course outline, so thank you. Oh, I see a raised hand. Yes, Andrea, you can open your mic. Yeah.
First of all, thank you very much for the presentation. It makes me feel better about starting undergrad students and teaching and expecting replication early. In terms of starting reproducibility from day one, I've usually worked with the CRDCN data, but kind of thinking about contacting, say, like a health authority for a particular project, and that would require like data access contracts. Do you have any suggestions for what kind of should be included in that? Like, and what made me think of this is you said some won't even let you share the cleaning code. Is there kind of like best practices for starting that relationship, even if the data will remain confidential?
So there's a few things that you can ask and build into that, and we're starting to see this emerging. One of the key things, and this is where it helps to sort of have like the data and code availability policy, the standard that multiple journals have. That's one of the reasons we put that out there, is that you can point to that. Here's what practice is. If you want the study that I'm going to do to be published in a top journal, you have no choice but to comply with these kinds of things. Otherwise, we're not going to get published, right? So we're happy to play the bad cop in those kinds of situations. We're also happy to then actually discuss with people in these agencies and inform them of what that actually means. It does not mean that you need to publish the data. It just means that you need to have a mechanism in place for others to also get the data, and maybe to have an exception in place that somebody can come in and audit your stuff. Audit is a language they know, and run the code on them, right? So simple things such as, well, if in 5 years from now, my contract is done, I thought I was done, the journal needs to put somebody back on, who can get back onto that contract? Can we resuscitate that contract? Can we reopen it? Can we put an RA on a contract who wasn't involved in the original stuff, who can come in and just run through the code again for a limited time? All those are things that have happened, but for which I don't have very good template code or other things like that. I did post recently as data editor on Blue Sky about something where somebody in Sweden pointed out that according to their latest interpretation of the privacy laws, opening up a research contract and adding somebody in for the explicit purpose of checking it for the journals is a legitimate use, right? I don't think they changed their law, but there's now a recognition within those contexts that that's a legitimate use of what's going on. Making that clear from the outset, especially if you're talking to somebody who's not used to working with academia, is probably worthwhile, just so that expectations are clear about what are you going to remove from the secure enclave if that's what you're using, etc. And then it makes sense to sort of say, okay, put down on paper, what are the things that you guys are nervous about, right? Are you nervous that the code might reveal the I don't know, the password to the SQL database that you have to query or something like that? Well, there's ways to do that that are secure and are accepted, etc. We can work around that. Okay. Are you worried about that you're going to put in the code, if person equals John Doe, then do this thing? There's ways to do that. You probably shouldn't do that. So there's secure programming practices as well. So there's ways to reassure providers, but it's a conversation, and sometimes those conversations also don't succeed. So I don't have a magic formula.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. And on that note, I think we will end this webinar. Merci encore, Lars, I'll just put Lars' Blue Sky account in the chat, so if you want to follow Lars. And this, just wanted to mention that this webinar was recorded and be made available on the QICSS YouTube channel very soon. So encore merci beaucoup, Lars, pour le temps et la présentation.
Thanks for
Have a
having
good
me.
afternoon, everyone.